Good morning, everybody. My name is Andy Bates. I'm the Innovation Manager here at Business West, and a very warm welcome to our autumn webinar and thought leadership series, Innovate 2021, Overcoming Challenges and Building for Growth, which is supported by Business West and Innovate UK. This series of webinars is running every Tuesday morning throughout the autumn, covering topics from design thinking, which we'll hear today, to funding and finance, to leadership strategy, and sales and marketing, as well as promoting the wider bespoke support available from us and how we can add value to your future growth plans in what we all agree is very challenging times. This session is the second of our two-part series in design thinking, and I'm delighted once again to introduce my colleague Sarah Dickens, who'll be our host for this session, which is titled Design Thinking, Innovating Through a Crisis, something I'm sure we could all learn a little bit about. As participants of Innovate 2021 and subject to Innovate UK eligibility criteria, there is the opportunity to access our comprehensive range of support business services, which does include design thinking. And I'll discuss next steps and how to access those services at the end of this session. But before I hand over to Sarah, there's just a couple of housekeeping bits that I'd like to talk you through. First off, just to remind everybody that for on-demand purposes, this webinar is being recorded and that your personal video and microphones won't be used unless you're invited to speak by one of the hosts. We do have a chat function as part of this webinar, so you're able to communicate with other attendees, and that is unmoderated, just so you know. And if you do have a problem as well, then please do raise your hand and just indicate that you need assistance, and one of the team will get to you, I'm sure. And then the final bit is that we do have a Q&A function as part of Zoom today. And if you have any questions, you can either ask them in person or ask them anonymously. This is being moderated, and we'll pick those up as we go through the webinar today. And also we'll just pick them up at the end probably. And just to say that if you could just make sure that you put your Q&As, your questions into that function and not into the chat, because as I said, we just don't moderate the chat function. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Sarah and to begin the session. So Sarah, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Hi everyone, welcome to the session. This is Design Thinking, Innovating Through a Crisis. So my name is Sarah Dickens, as Andy said, and my role is Design Innovation Specialist. I previously worked in a product development consultancy in Bristol for 5 years before joining Business West. So I kind of bring experience from working with much larger sort of generally multinationals corporates, where these kind of principles are quite well ingrained in a lot of the more kind of cutting edge companies. So sort of, I guess like Coca-Cola, Sony, Unilever, name drop a few. But those kind of principles have been really interesting in the last couple of years when I've spent with Business West and seeing how they're kind of useful for SMEs in a very practical way, working with SMEs in the Southwest. So I'm really looking forward to today's presentation. Just before we start, just going to flick on, there's a Slido just to give me an idea of who you are. So if you've used one of these before, you basically either scan the QR code with your phone or open another tab in your browser and type in slido.com and add the code, and then just let me know if sort of how familiar you are with design thinking. So are you just dipping your toe in? Well, someone's voted, thank you very much. Do you have some familiarity or do you actually have a background in design? Because that will really help me to sort of know who I'm talking to. It's just worth saying that last week we had an excellent webinar which was design thinking and all about how to drive a user-centered approach up the agenda in your company. So if you do want to access a recording of that, Andy will tell you a bit more about that at the end of the show. We particularly of the webinar, we particularly sort of focused there on first of all choosing an approach that actually suits you as a company. And also on culture, which is one of the really key elements for design thinking. So I'm not going to talk too much about those ones today. We're going to have some sort of fresh material today, but yeah, if you do want to access that, then listen out at the end of the webinar. Brilliant. So It looks like most people have some familiarity, and I haven't even had to vote myself, which is amazing because I've got my phone here just in case no one voted. So brilliant. So some familiarity, a few people dipping toe in, and then a couple with design background, which is really interesting. Brilliant. So thank you very much for voting in that. Keep your phone or that tab open, because later on in the presentation, we will go back to that for a couple of other questions as well. So I wanted to start with this really interesting quote, which I found on the Design Council. They produced a report called The Design Economy in 2018. Churchill's war government established the Council for Industrial Design, or now called the Design Council, in 1944, just after the war, to support the economic renewal of the nation. The country turned to design to rebuild, innovate, and instigate growth. And that was just a really helpful reminder for me of actually, you know, when we're in times where we don't have the answers, or we don't know what to do almost, it's really helpful to have a new approach. And I think that's kind of the way that we're looking at design thinking at the moment, is it's not an extra, it's not a nice to have, it's kind of, you know, when we don't know quite what we're working with, when the market's changing, when we need to adapt, maybe some of the product lines that we've been relying on don't work anymore, or are kind of reducing in terms of impact. We need a new approach. So that's kind of where we're building this today. I just thought that was a really interesting quote to start on. You probably saw James, one of our colleagues, fished out this great statistic about from McKinsey & Company about companies that invest in innovation through a crisis outperform peers during the recovery. So this is a graph of the 2008 recession, just showing how companies which invested in innovation, which is the top blue line, sort of increased in terms of their sort of their recovery from that recession, is far greater than those companies, which is the black line, who didn't invest in innovation. But we know that's probably not all about just about budget, just about money. Yes, our natural instinct can be to sort of hibernate when things get a bit tough. I'm sure some of you have been doing that a little bit during sort of lockdown times. And the instinct is to reduce energy, to kind of curl up a little bit in a ball and sort of get through the winter time. But actually the statistics show that although that's our natural instinct, that we kind of actually need to do the opposite. We need to innovate during those times in order to stay on top, to stay with the market and be able to recover really well. This is quite a common sort of Venn diagram for business of viability, feasibility and desirability. But there's a reason why I've put desirability at the top, and I know I'm completely biased, but when we're learning how to focus business and thinking about how to maybe cut costs, how to reduce expenditure, things like that, focus is absolutely paramount. So, you know, without desirability, without something that someone wants to buy, so there's no point in spending a lot of time making something really viable, you know, maybe working out lots of very complex, you know, export documentation for Brexit, spending a lot of time doing something like that on desirable to the customer, because that's just a waste of time, isn't it? You want to be able to focus your energy in the right place, and design thinking is really, really helpful for that. So at the beginning of lockdown, me and my family got very into Marie Kondo, and I don't know how many people were kind of following that trend as well. I'm just going to introduce our second Slido, so do type that into your browser or scan the QR code. Are you a hoarder or a minimalist? So if you're a compulsive hoarder, born minimalist already, brilliant. And did you get obsessed with Marie Kondo during the lockdown? I think that's my vote. If my phone's still unlocked, I'm going to vote that one. So yeah, brilliant. So carry on voting as I'm speaking, but Marie Kondo for me is a brilliant picture of focus. It was sort of almost like with our homes, we realized like there's all this clutter around us, and we need to figure out what we use, what we love, and then get rid of the rest. And I think this is a good picture of how design thinking can actually help us to slimline business, to focus on the right things, come out really, really strong at the other side of the current climate at the moment, the crisis that we're in, by kind of focusing using design thinking methods. So thank you for those votes. Keep on voting if you haven't yet voted. Only 6% got obsessed with Marie Kondo during lockdown. Maybe it's just me then. Brilliant. Just going to give a quick overview of today's session. So I'm going to kick off, we've done a little bit of the background of almost like the statistics on design, design thinking, the wider view of that. We're going to look at the process very quickly, just to check that we're all on the same page. Then we're going to look at empathy, creativity, and collaboration, which are 3 aspects of design thinking, which actually are quite under threat at the moment in our current climate. And then the meat of what we're going to be doing today is looking through some case studies. So we're looking at a really interesting, innovative optometry startup, so eye testing. We're going to look at a fast-growing event ticketing company. And then we're also going to look at a manufacturer of lab equipment. So 3 totally different companies, very different sizes, all 3 companies that I've worked with in the last kind of year or so, implementing a design thinking approach. Helping with different parts of the process, as we'll discuss. And I just want to make this really real, so actually kind of share with you the story and the journey that we've been on with each of those companies. And out of those case studies, I'm going to kind of illustrate the 5 key benefits that I think are most relevant right now in this current climate for design thinking. Great. So first of all, to the process. So this is taken from IDEO's design thinking process. IDEO popularized the process about 20 years ago and brought that into kind of the business environment as opposed to just designing products. We have discovery, which is all about meeting people, engaging with customers and users, usually first-hand qualitative research rather than surveys. We've got interpretation, which is looking at that data and finding the insights using tools to do that. You have ideation, which, big mind maps, brainstorms, and to come up with new solutions from that inspiration. And then experimentation, which is testing with users really early on in the process. Evolution is the last stage, and that is there because sometimes with much wider scope projects, you might need to do the process more than once in order to narrow down to an actual specification for a product. So you have discovery, interpretation, ideation, experimentation, and then potentially evolution as well. So I know that's a really quick whiz through. We will kind of illustrate that in terms of the different companies that we're going through later. So empathy, creativity, and collaboration. 3 really key elements of design thinking. Sort of very much right brain activities. I mean, there's a lot of debate about right brain, left brain, but kind of for the illustrative purposes, right brain activities, empathy, creativity, things that can get lost in the current climate. You can see how that would happen. Empathy becomes increasingly difficult when actually we are further away from our customers. Some people who would have been able to, if you're selling a product on the supermarket shelf, you'd have been able to just go and run some research in supermarkets. Becomes much more tricky with the current regulations and restrictions. Perhaps there's with creativity in an environment of fear or pressure. I don't know if you've noticed, but I find myself, I can work myself through my email inbox or do something that's very sort of methodical and go through, but something more creative like writing this webinar, it was actually a bit of a push to do something more creative in an environment of pressure. And the other part here is collaboration, which is obviously much more tricky when you're not in the same place and we're having to find new tools and methods of ways of doing that. That's why we need to be intentional in the current climate. So, if you're going to cook a beautiful meal for perhaps an in-law, a family member, or somebody that you want to impress, that kind of surefire way is to go for like a HelloFresh box or a recipe. We've just started doing HelloFresh, and I was amazed by the way, this is not an advert for HelloFresh, by the way, but I was amazed by the way that you can just actually just follow the recipe and it comes out pretty well every time. Follow a recipe that is proven that is going to work, that you can trust and is assured. At the moment, particularly in SMEs, I think a lot of these things happen quite casually. So perhaps the CEO will every now and then chat to some customers or be in that kind of world. Perhaps if for instance, we used to work with a company who were producing wetsuits, and pretty much all of their employees were scuba divers in some context or another. So they would have had some kind of experience of that. But those kind of casual experiences, maybe they're not possible anymore. So we have to get intentional with the way that we put that in place. How do we create an environment for empathy and for people to really connect with users' needs when we can't do that casually anymore? The next part, creativity, again, because of the increase in sort of pressure at the moment and the kind of slightly strange environments that people find themselves in, creativity becomes much harder. We need almost like a safe space, an environment and a place for it. Whereas before we might have, say, bounced ideas around in an office, in a separate room, something like that, with a few Post-its on a wall, or even potentially in a conversation over coffee. It becomes much harder to do that when you're kind of remote, when you're working on your own, perhaps when you maybe just have to stay further away from people and can't use Post-its in the same way that you can. I'm definitely missing Post-its at the moment. So there's a place for being really intentional about that. Similarly with collaboration, we'll do an interesting poll later on which collaborative tools people are finding most helpful to sort of idea share during this. But it's collaboration is under threat, isn't it? It's much harder to collaborate in the current environment, but it is possible, and that's kind of where we need to again be intentional. So you've probably got the message about being intentional there. I'm going to go on into 3 key case studies. So the first case study, I think, is a brilliant demonstration of how to create a compelling business case for investors by validating ideas with your audience early on. So this is Occo Health case study. And one of the key things that they do really, really well at Occo Health is get investment. Another thing that they do particularly well is by testing early on again, they're reducing wasted resource by developing something that won't work or won't sell. It's like they're testing at every stage. And so this is the process. Now, Occo Health is the optometry startup I mentioned earlier, and their product is effectively eye testing, remote eye testing. And obviously this was going on way before the lockdown, but there are lots of different user opportunities, needs that have arisen since then, lots of new things coming up. So it'd be really interesting to see how they develop in the coming months. This is the process again, but we particularly help them with the discovery to ideation phase of the process, so the right at the start. And that was because they were already running agile project management, which is effectively taking feedback in small chunks, prioritizing what to work on, and then implementing it. So they were already kind of doing the second part of this process, which is the experimentation part. Here's a couple of real successes that Occo have had recently. So they won an Innovate UK competition to develop technology in response to the coronavirus pandemic recently, which is amazing. They also got accepted for Tech Nation's Applied AI program. And these were just in the last couple of months. They've had a track record of being really successful at getting investment. And that's because they really know how to test concepts with users. They know how to do that kind of experimentation part of the process really, really well. And so that's kind of why we were working with them. Here's another example on their website. It's one of their user testers commented that it's clear that Occo really value their users' feedback and that the co-design process had been nothing but great. Here's just a little glimpse of their of what their app looks like. It's a number of sort of gamified methods of eye testing. And it's a really interesting product because it has the potential to combat things like macular degeneration, can't say it, which can happen very quickly and can cause a lot of sight loss between opticians' appointments. So what did we do? This is Sally from Occo. We did some discovery work, which was meeting real patients, real clients. with Occo and talking to them about how they felt, uncovering things about the user behavior, the user needs, the way that they might interact with a piece of software like this. It was really interesting. What we didn't do was focus on the technicality. Occo already had a team who were looking at the technical feasibility of sort of, did these eye tests actually work, the science behind it? And that's what we weren't doing that at all. This discovery was very much based on behavior, on the sort of soft side, I guess. Then we did some interpretation with Occo. So you can see some of our post-its on the wall there. This part was about taking what we'd heard and figuring out what the key themes were. What were the interesting things that we'd heard? Where were the insights? And then ideation. This was about thinking around those insights and thinking of lots of new ideas, new ways to solve it. Some of those would have been things that weren't implementable, weren't feasible. But the idea is that you have lots and lots of ideas. So then at the end of the day, you can down select and choose the very best ideas from those. Unfortunately, it's one of those processes where you just can't shortcut to the best idea initially. It's one of those things you won't end up with the best idea if you just have 10 ideas. If you have 100 ideas, you may end up with a really, really strong idea at the end. And here's a couple of quotes from them. So a quote from Sally about that working with us helped her to understand things from the user's perspective, and they learned some more methods and tools to help with that. And from Steph, who's the CEO, so building a process into their company so that user insights are drawn and acted upon at every stage of the development process. So here's how we help them to develop that process into their company. And I'm confident they'll take that forward now, particularly given the structure that they already have in place as a company. So that was an example of Occo Health, and the two particular benefits that I wanted to focus on now was they're particularly good at creating compelling business cases, and design thinking really helped with that. So help them to know what was important to users, what was important to their stakeholders, and how to write that into a business case, and then validating the idea with customers so that there's proof, there's evidence to give to investors when they go forward with those business cases. It's a really strong idea. As an aside, Innovate UK have started to build design foundations into some of their grants at the moment along those same kind of lines. So to help them to almost prove the business case before they give the grant, in a similar way to the way that some of the larger corporations work. So really helpful for creating a compelling business case. The other thing that it was really helpful for was that it gave them an assurance that they were working on the right thing, they were focusing on the right thing, reduced kind of wasted time and effort working on ideas. You can imagine with something so innovative, it would be easy to go off down rabbit holes. But at every stage they were testing with users, so they knew that they were going in an appropriate direction, something that people would want, and they're still doing this now. They're carrying this on now through this kind of time where actually there are changing needs. So brilliant. So I hope you enjoyed that one. That was Occo Health. The next case study is Helm Tickets. So I think Helm Tickets was they are an online ticketing software and solution. So they a little bit like Eventbrite. And that was actually their problem in terms of quite often a lot of their customers were coming from Eventbrite. And so a lot of the feedback that they would be getting from their customers was based on like, oh, Eventbrite doesn't really do this particularly well. We would prefer you to do this, or, Eventbrite does this better in some way. Could you add this feature? Maybe disgruntled Eventbrite customers coming to them with feedback, which was a little bit sort of edge use case as well. So with that kind of feedback coming into the company, they already had an established feedback loop, but the problem was that they actually, instead of just having feedback, they needed to do something with that feedback to be able to interpret it better, to figure out where the areas were for focus, how to actually differentiate themselves in that kind of competitive market, and be seen as someone very different to Eventbrite. When we first met them, a couple of their USPs were kind of things like being smaller and kind of being able to spend lots of time on the phone with customers, but that's not scalable. And similarly, some of these edge use cases were really impacting. So some of the customers that they were getting wanted to do quite unusual things with the events. So if they built those features in, they could waste spending a lot of time answering one or two customer needs and then missing the rest of the market. So a kind of key benefit that we wanted to demonstrate here is just differentiating in a competitive market and how design thinking can help you to think creatively from a fresh perspective. Again, we were focusing on the discovery to ideation phase of this project, and we actually ran this project as a design sprint. So that means it's a kind of condensed program with 3 days, I think, and we went back for an extra day at the end. So it was quite a focused kind of program. Interestingly enough, the discovery phase of this was actually remote. So we met a lot of their event organizers over Zoom before Zoom was so popular. And yeah, so we were already working remotely with this, and that works absolutely fine. Once we'd kind of, and it's probably worth saying that we actually involved their whole team in this process. So we involved their software development team, a few of their software engineers, as well as their project managers. I think their team was about 11 people at the time, just to give you a bit of context. So it's the whole team that was involved with this. After we'd heard and captured what people had said, we then ran some interpretation exercises. So these included kind of putting things in themes, putting the most important comments that we'd heard on the wall, kind of organising those in a way that would help us to pick out the insights or the really interesting, relevant pieces of information. And then the next stage from that was ideation. So that was where we went through and had ideas based on those themes. And interestingly enough, this is a really interesting demonstration here of like, this process doesn't go perfectly every time. But the whole point is to, because it's very different in different environments and different contexts, but the way that it works best is if you can run through the whole process and then you kind of think, okay, what do we need to change? Do we need to go through it a bit again? So actually, when we came out of this after ideation, I realized that actually some of the ideas that come forward were a little bit superficial. They were almost things that I think may have been in people's heads beforehand, maybe weren't quite, they didn't have that kind of sharp angle on some of the user insights that was really needed. So we actually went back and did another session with Helm Squared, where we sort of went round again. And that was really helpful because the second time we came up with really interesting, sort of more in-depth ideas that really kind of reflected the user needs and what we'd heard. So it's really worth doing that. Really helpful because through this whole process, Helm realized that actually their USP didn't need to be something like spending lots of the time on the phone with people or the price, but actually they had a real USP where people were seeing them as a more organizer-centric company. There were a lot of the organizers were wanting something where it was almost like the dashboard, the organizer experience was really kind of heralded as the most important part of the process, as opposed to the end user. So we worked with them to come up with a strategy of a number of different features that they can implement to focus on the organizer experience, as opposed to Eventbrite, where they focus on the end user. And so that was really interesting, been really, really successful. I think that was 600% growth one year we were working with them. So doing really, really well. Obviously, at the moment, I haven't actually picked up with these guys for about half a year, just because of the way our programs run. And at the moment, obviously, they have new challenges because event ticketing in these times, tricky. But this process is going to stand them in good stead for when the tough times come, because they will be able to pivot. And I saw from some of the things that they're doing online that they are actually doing that at the moment. So that was Helm Tickets, and that was how to differentiate in an overcrowded market. And the final case study that we have is, I can't mention the name of this one, but it's a manufacturer of lab equipment who won Employer of the Year last year. So really interesting. This manufacturer of lab equipment have been a really amazing team, slightly larger company. And they are a brilliant example of where design thinking has helped a team come together during this current crisis. So it's been over the last kind of few weeks that I've been running some of these workshops. help them to make cohesive decisions as a team by kind of slightly formalizing and structuring their remote collaboration. So rather than just having a Zoom meeting to collaborate on something, there's been tools, there's been an approach which they've been able to follow step by step, which has been really helpful for them to do this sort of creative solution finding and decision making. I think they're a brilliant example of adapting to changing markets without losing sight of the customer. So at the moment, there are lots of changes in most markets. Most of our companies are facing significant changes. And actually, some of the research that they've done previously, they almost need to check that again in order to make sure that what they're doing is headed in the right direction. So it's really interesting from some of the interviews that were coming up with this manufacturer, just the kind of changing needs that were coming about, some of the trends which were quite far off around remote working for them in labs were actually brought in dramatically a couple of years because of the current landscape and the changing expectations of the market and needs. And actually, for this company, we were actually helping them with quite a defined part of the process, so the interpretation phase. And this was because when we worked with them previously, we'd given them the process and they'd begun as a team to do the discovery part, which was the going out and finding clients and actually speaking to them one-on-one. So they had a really good bank of sort of interviews. It may be that you're at this stage with your company that you've actually done quite a bit of user research, but it's almost like, what do we do with that user research? How do we make the most of it? So that was their question to us. How do we make the most of this user research that we've done? We know that we've got valuable information, but what do we do with it and how do we implement that and make the most of it? These aren't real photos, but this is kind of, this is our Zoom conversations with their clients and stakeholders. I wasn't actually involved with these. These were recorded previous to our interviews and run by their team, who did a great job. The part where we really came in was the interpretation phase. So this took place as a number of, we had 3 sort of work sessions as a wider team, and they were really keen to bring their whole sort of management team on board with this process to help the whole company to center itself around the user. And the whole reason for this process is because it is really easy to get those sort of superficial insights from interviews. So, I'd like a product to be convenient, good value, and flexible. Well, brilliant. But what does a designer do with that? How does a designer, there's no information there, which helps a designer to design something that's convenient, good value, and flexible. We need a bit more information as a designer. Having worked as a designer for quite a few years, it's much better to have information. How do they actually see convenient? Like, what constitutes as convenient to them? Might be very, very different for different people. What constitutes as to good value? It may be actually the cost structure or the way that they're paying for it, as opposed to the ultimate cost of something. And flexibility similarly can be really, really different for different people. And that's, I think, where design thinking is really helpful. So obviously I've blurred all of these out, but the first step for us was to watch the footage of the interviews, and we actually divided this up among the different team members and asked them to find the interesting comments. We were using Jamboard here. If you're using Jamboard, you just need to be a bit careful with the privacy implications of these different softwares that you can use online, but it's a great way of being able to use sort of virtual post-it notes in order to collaborate. So as a team, they decided to note these different insights, basically we asked them to look for the interesting quotes that were coming out that they thought were relevant or different, gave them a bit of coaching on that and sent them away for the next session. And they did really by these kind of covered boards here that they went through in great detail and found all of those interesting nuggets of information. Our next stage, it doesn't look very neat and tidy at this point, but there is method in the madness. Each of these sheets has a title on it, which was a theme. So basically this is us kind of reshuffling those observations and grouping them under these different themes. We'd kept the colours the same because the colours are the different stakeholders. So that helped us to keep track. Where we've got a sheet where there's lots of yellows, for instance, that would have been a particular type of lab. If there's a sheet where there's lots of blues, that would have been another type of lab. So it's really helpful for them to keep track of that. And then at the end of this, this is the kind of the last activity that we did, which was voting on the key themes, which we saw on the page previously. So we chose a few of those key themes that seemed like the most important to them, the most relevant, and that would have been based on viability and feasibility, among other things. And then, really importantly, framing the opportunity succinctly. So describing the opportunity. How might we become more flexible by doing this and that? And then putting all of those quotes, those interesting comments on that sheet of paper. And the whole point of this kind of exercise is to create, it's almost like a lump of charcoal, a piece of fuel for an inspired creative session. So the idea is that that will really fuel that creative session. So you can see on the left-hand side there, that was a sort of 5-minute ideas session, and all of the pink post-its there are ideas that came up during that session. So once you have that in place, once you frame that idea properly, it's really, really easy to have those good ideas from that. And those ideas won't be the kind of ideas that have been knocking around your office for a long time. They'll be the kind of quality ideas where it's like, oh yeah, I've never seen it that way, or that makes a lot of sense, but I can't believe we've never thought of that before. So those were kind of, it's quite an in-depth look, but those 3 sort of sessions that we ran, I think that's an interesting example of how structuring for how kind of design thinking can be used for 2 things. So firstly, for helping with this remote collaboration as a team, particularly our R&D teams, and then also helping to adapt or ensure that ideas are still relevant to a changing market. Great, so I hope you've enjoyed those 3 case studies. I'm just going to run through the list of these key benefits that I've been pulling out here. So first of all, one benefit of design thinking is to help us to create a compelling business case. Validating ideas early on, like we saw with Occo Health, they're really, really good at that. And the investment showed that they had really, really cracked that. Again, reducing wasted time and effort on products that people don't actually want, that don't meet user needs or maybe aren't completely tailored to the user. So that's another one where actually Occo Health had really managed to focus their operations in an innovative market where there was lots of different things that they could do. They'd managed to focus on the things that were most important to the stakeholders and the users. And we had differentiating in an overcrowded market, which was Helm Squared. So how to stand out from a competitor, maybe quite an overbearing competitor. Had adapting to a changing market, which is probably relevant for everyone right now. And that was the lab equipment manufacturer. And then also helping with this remote collaboration by giving a bit of a structure to it. So if any of those things are relevant for you as a business, it might be really worth, feel free to ask some questions in the Q&A if you have questions that have come up out of that. I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions. If some of those things are really relevant for you as a business, do get in touch with us, because there's an opportunity to join us for one of our schemes. We run fully funded schemes, funded by Innovate UK and Enterprise Europe Network, that help us to support innovative SMEs. And it may be that some of these benefits could really help you right now in your business, whether it's helping you with the remote collaboration, whether it's you need to differentiate better from competitors because the market's become more crowded, whether it's creating a really good business case for investment, or any of these other benefits. So yeah, I think that's me done in terms of content, but we've got a Q&A session here, which I think Andy's going to run. So I'm sure Andy will jump back on in a sec to bring that one up.
Yeah, I am here. It's just my technology seems to be taking a little while to bring me back in. Here I am. Yeah, I was clicking madly. Yeah, brilliant. So thank you very much for that, Sarah, and a very warm virtual round of applause for that and taking us through that. It is very, very fascinating, the whole design thinking process. Interestingly, we've had one question come in from an anonymous attendee, which was probably one of the ones I was going to start on, and she kindly referred to a bit of them, which was the recommended tools to use for some of this process. And if you've got any insight into those, I suppose starting with Jamboard by the sounds of it.
Yeah, so it was really interesting. We did quite a lot of research into this right at the start of the right at the start of the crisis at the moment, knowing that companies would have these kind of questions. There's so many different tools out there. I think the simplest ones are often the best. So I would really recommend Jamboard, but you do need to check if you have G Suite, then you'll have different permissions and privacy policy from if you're using it as a free user. So do be aware if you're using it as a free user, there may well be confidentiality problems. They don't promise confidentiality on Jamboard unless you have G Suite, like our clients had, the lab manufacturer had G Suite. So I would recommend trying that out. Really, really simple program to use. People can pick it up instantly. There are quite a few other tools. Miro's a good one. Trello could work. You know, if your team's really used to using Trello, it may well be that you just adapt the process to work with Trello. The only thing with if you are used to using Trello is that some of these tools are very good for to-do lists, but then the whole idea is that you get rid of the content afterwards. So in Trello, the whole point is that you archive things once they're done. There is a use with design thinking of keeping records. So that's why I'd favour something like Jamboard, where you can of what you've got as a record of where you've been and what you've done, because then when you get through the process again, you can see where you've been. So yeah, I'd try Jamboard, Miro, Trello as first offs.
Yeah, I think that's sage words, particularly on the being able to record and to reflect and to look back as well. That's a really important part of the process, which I know you've told us in previous webinars before that it is a process, and it's very important that you go all the way through it. I'll move on to Jake Larson. Jake's got a good one around top books, TED Talks, other pieces of content that you would recommend, particularly for newbies.
Yeah, brilliant. So, I mean, there's a really traditional classic, which is Changed by Design, which is brilliant. If you want to read up into the background of this, it's by Tim Brown, who is one of the co-founders of IDEO, who popularized the design thinking method. So I'd go with that one as a really good first start, really good first basis. I'm struggling to remember. I had a really great, oh man, now I'm gonna forget it now. I might look it up in a second. There's a really great podcast that I heard recently, which was called something like Design Isn't Just for Designers, and that was really interesting. And that was a great kind of, if you're trying to implement design, I can't remember who it's by, but if you type that in, you might come up with something good. That was really useful. There's also quite a few, the Stanford Design Deck, they do a few kind of interesting examples of tools that you can use in your business. But yeah, it's probably worth getting in touch, and I can probably give you a fuller list if you're interested in sort of reading up a little bit more. Yeah, feel free to give me an email.
That's great. Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to Danny now. And Danny, again, coming back to process, what they're asking is that you mentioned sprinting through 3 stages of the entire process. Could you sprint the whole process and then come back to key stages, or would you not recommend doing this?
Yeah, so actually a design sprint does tend to, in a very short way, cover the whole process. So if you look up, that's actually another great place to look, is if you type in Google Design Sprint on YouTube. There's a number of really good videos, very, very American, very cheesy, but great videos on the Google Design Sprint process. I tend to find the sprint process that they do is a little bit light on that discovery, that first stage, because they're trying to cram so much information in. So that's the only kind of part that sometimes I tend to slightly hybridize with clients, but it does take you through all of those stages. So it's a really great way to go back. And then, like you said, you can go back through and kind of revisit some of the stages, a bit like we did with Helm Squared, when you know, if you come out with, say, an idea, some ideas at the end which feel a little bit superficial, maybe go back round again and kind of look again at some of those processes. You might well need a design thinking professional to sort of help you to do that part of it, but it would be a good start.
And I've got one. I'll greedily take the mic. There's one for myself, which was, I wonder if you've got any experience of the companies you've worked with where you really nicely took us through how you do the ideation and how you do some of that side of it in a lockdown type environment, or in a world where we're doing a lot more remote working now, around the observing users bit in a remote world. Have you come across any companies that have kind of cracked that nut, or any innovative ways of doing that? Because I imagine that could be quite hard.
Yeah, I think creative thinking is definitely sort of the way of going about that. In my previous role, we were actually experimenting a lot with different ways of observing users. A lot of scenarios, you can't actually just go and watch someone doing something. You know, we used to run some programs where we've watched people put on makeup and literally watch them do it at 7 a.m. in the morning before they go to work. You know, and that would be our research, and it could actually watch them go through the process of putting on makeup. It's really interesting and slightly creepy. But what you can't do is, you know, for some processes, it's like, for instance, CRM systems, and one of our other clients, it's actually very difficult to watch somebody doing everything they do on a CRM system, because people pop in and out of it at different times of the day over several weeks. Some things they may not use, or other colleagues might use it kind of every now and then. These things aren't necessarily sort of, so we've always had this problem of sort of figuring out how can we get closer to the action, how can we observe things. You know, often a mixture, you can train people up on the inside to know what they're looking for and get them almost to record when they think like, oh, there's a problem. That's one way of doing it. Sometimes you can, you know, go very high tech. I don't think this is going to be relevant to SMEs actually, but, you know, people do sort of eye tracking and those kind of methods, which, you know, in some markets are really relevant for getting people in place, headcounts, things like that. You can, often you can get people to talk you through the process and then go through it kind of as if they were taking it through you step by step. It's not quite as good as observing it in person, but it's just thinking creatively and finding the best way of getting close to the action, and just being aware of any sort of any assumptions that you may have to make, or any kind of imperfections in your process, I guess, along the way.
No, that's great. No, thank you for that. So yeah, that's given us some really good insight on and how you could do that. And yeah, definitely the creative, just some creative problem solving, I guess, is definitely the way to go. One question that's come in from James Snellgrove is he's interested to know what role culture plays within the company in supporting design thinking.
Great. So actually, I think culture is almost one of the key parts of design thinking. We haven't touched on it very much today, because last week's webinar, we sort of talked about for about half of the webinar. So please do check that one out, and Andy will send out some details later. Yeah, I think culture is the reason, in real short here, but culture is the reason why some companies really take to design thinking and are able to become user-centric companies, you know, and really focus themselves around the user. And whereas some companies, you can go, and I've had them, where you go in, you do a design program, and then you go back there and nothing has changed. And maybe there were a couple of good outcomes from the design program, so they might have created a good product out of it, but actually they won't be able to do that repeatedly in the company. It won't become like an internal thing, and that's where culture is really important. So yeah, absolutely paramount. Thanks, James, and do check out last week's webinar if you're interested in culture.
I remember you showed us, I think last week, there was a graph with 4 steps, and it is going from those companies that are kind of just dipping their toe and starting to understand about design thinking, all the way through to those that have it's intrinsic within the business and everything that they do. And I am going to go back and have a look at that chart, because I can't remember the details.
Ladder, really helpful. Yeah, great. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, that's a good point.